Okay, I think we will begin. So welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Gail Mandel and I am the Deputy Director at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I'm so pleased that you have joined us today for our program, Researching Your Family History. The museum's mission is to explore the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teach the universal lessons of the Holocaust, and provide opportunities for intercultural conversation. We challenge our visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just and inclusive world. Almost all of the museum's virtual programming, including today's event, and recordings of past events are offered without charge, and we would be grateful for any donation that you might be able to make to support our work. If you wish to support the museum in this way, or perhaps explore membership, please visit the support page on our website. The museum is now open Wednesday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. In addition to our 3 core exhibitions, currently we have 2 powerful and timely special exhibitions on view. In the Menashe Gallery is Hank Pander, the artist as eyewitness to history, which features 4 large-scale paintings that reflect the scenes Pander witnessed firsthand at the 2020 Portland Justice Center protests. In the main gallery, To Bear Witness, Extraordinary Lives, captures the stories of 14 brave men and women who witnessed the atrocities of war, genocide, and the Holocaust before leaving their homelands for safe haven in Oregon. The museum offers a wide range of virtual programs, and in recognition of March being Women's History Month, OJMCHE is pleased to share that all of this month's programming, including today's, features and highlights women. I encourage you to visit the upcoming events page on the museum's website for more information. Now turning to today's program. OJMCHE is pleased to present Researching Your Family History, a conversation with Naomi Derner and Estelle Golden, moderated by OJMCHE Archivist Alicia Babstein. Derner and Golden will share their insights on how to research and use source materials, family letters, journals, perhaps oral histories, along with genealogical tools to help empower families to trace their histories and add to the collective knowledge of our Jewish community. Naomi Derner is the granddaughter of 4 Holocaust survivors, and while she grew up spending a lot of time with her grandparents, they almost never spoke of the Holocaust, leaving Derner with very little knowledge of their experiences. It wasn't until after her last grandparent passed away in 2013 that Derner began to research their histories. Derner is a business appraiser in Portland, the mother of 2 teenagers, and a trustee of Congregation Beth Israel in Portland and the Oregon Jewish Community Foundation. Estelle Golden is the daughter of Diana Golden, survivor of Auschwitz, and Kenneth Golden, a musician and owner of a music store. Golden was born and raised in Portland. She graduated from Linfield College and worked for many years in software development. Now retired, Golden is a member of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education Speakers Bureau, sharing her mother's story of survival and hope. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to my colleague, Alicia Babstein.
Thank you so much, Gail. And thank you all for being here with us. And thank you very much to Naomi and Estelle for being here to have this conversation and to just share what your experience has been like with our community. So I'm going to ask questions back and forth. I'll direct some specifically to each of you, and please feel free to bounce ideas off of each other and answer questions even if it has not been directed to you. So I know you've got a lot to say about everything that we can talk about today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in. And Estelle, I'm going to ask you first, actually, if you can talk a little bit about what were you looking for that sparked your interest in family research, and if you were researching for someone in particular.
Sure. Thank you, Alicia. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, as you heard in the introduction, my mother, Diana Golden, was a survivor of Auschwitz. She was born on the island of Rhodes, which is now an island in the Mediterranean that belongs to Greece, but at the time was Italian. And eventually, the Nazi regime reached the island, and then she, along with everyone in the Jewish community there on Rhodes, was deported to Auschwitz. When she came to Portland, she didn't want to speak about it, but eventually she saw that she had to in the face of Holocaust denial. So she became a public speaker. And she literally spoke to thousands of people for decades. It was, I would hear from people how moving her story was. And At some point in her early 80s, she wanted to retire from public speaking as it was getting harder to travel to the speaking venues. This is before Zoom, of course. And the effort to tell her story became more and more taxing. I was still working, but I decided that when I would retire, I would take her place and continue to tell her important story. So I joined the Jewish Museum Speakers Bureau, and I developed my presentation, which I now share with others.
Fantastic, fantastic. Yeah, Naomi, please go ahead.
Yeah, but I'll just chime in because my experience was so different from Estelle's. So all four of my grandparents are Holocaust survivors, and I, as Alicia stated in the intro, and I grew up knowing that all my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, but really almost nothing else besides that. Nobody ever spoke about it in my family. I knew very, very little. I mean, practically nothing. And it was really, I was sparked by of all things, a pop-up ad that said from ancestry.com that said something along the lines of, do you wonder about your ancestors who came through Ellis Island? And I just thought to myself, kind of. I'm not even sure what country they came from. And so that just kind of sent me down the rabbit hole of looking for information. And I did find a lot of information, but that was kind of the inspiration. I was starting from almost nothing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Fantastic. So moving on to our next question, it's in the same vein. If you can talk a little bit about both of you, please. Naomi, you can start with this one. What you knew before you started your research, like what did you come into the process with, and what sort of primary source material you discovered, and besides primary source material, what else you were looking for, and how you would suggest other folks, what other material you'd suggest other folks look for?
Sure. So all my grandparents were survivors. On one side, on my mother's side, my grandparents were from Poland, and I knew they were Holocaust survivors, and that they had, after the Holocaust, they had gone back to Poland and then moved to Israel and then to the United States. But I really had not a lot of detail besides that. I'd heard something maybe that they had been in Russia, but that was of an era, where people didn't want to talk in front of children. At least in my family, nobody wanted to talk in front of children about this. So there was just really no detail. What I did come across only a few years ago was that in the 1990s, one of my cousins had sat down with my grandmother and had her story told. This is my cousin's wife, actually. And so there was an 8-hour recording of my one grandmother's life story. And that was just an amazing find. I had to kind of get the family to rifle through their basements to find it, but I got it, and I put it on CD, and I was able to listen to it. And that just opened my whole world onto that side of the family. So that was invaluable. And it's, I had to ask around my family to get that. On the other side of the family, those grandparents were what I realized were from Hungary. Although at the time, that hadn't been made clear to me. I knew that my grandparents spoke Hungarian and spoke Czech, but I didn't know really, what towns they were from or what had happened to them, and nobody seemed to be able to answer my questions. I had asked my father to look in the basement, and he came across a box that really had very little documentation, but it was the Google search I had talked about earlier that had really kind of led me to get the information, that I know today. And so it led me to a bunch of websites is really what it did. It led me, one website it led me to is Yad Vashem, the museum in Israel, and also the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, DC had a good bit of information. So on those websites, I was able to start tracking down a little bit of information about my family. There were some other places as well. So at the time when I started this search years ago, there wasn't, when I say years ago, I'm talking only 8 years ago, there wasn't as much information on the internet as there is now. So there's this service called the International Tracing Service that at the time was through basically the US Holocaust Museum, Memorial Museum in Washington, DC. And I was visiting DC, and I went to their desk in person because that was basically the only way to request something. And they printed out a bunch of information about my grandfather, my Hungarian grandfather, for me. And that was really kind of the breakthrough, I'd say, of information. Nowadays, though, you don't have to trek to Washington, D.C. to get that same information. Nowadays, there's a website called the Errolson Archives, and I think that Amber's going to put some of this information in the chat at some point, where they've put all that online and anybody could access it. And so that's where there's a lot of primary source documents, such as things like deportation lists. There's lists that showed what ships my parents and grandparents traveled on when coming to the U.S. There's the intake forms when my grandparents got to the displaced persons camp. So there's a lot online nowadays. And so I used a lot of different materials. But from my family, aside from my grandmother's tapes and just a couple of random documents on my Hungarian grandparents' side, I really wasn't starting from a whole lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Estelle, would you like to answer as well?
Well, I actually had a kind of an unusual problem with, again, my mother being a public speaker and having been interviewed countless times, and having been in the newspapers and books and so on and so forth. I actually had a huge amount of resource material. But I will kind of briefly say one thing that I didn't have when I started that I eventually did get. There was a letter that my mother wrote to her relatives very shortly after being liberated. And it's about 3 pages. It was written in Italian and we had to get it translated. So I gave it to the Jewish Museum, and then the whole family paid to have it translated from Italian. And that was really a remarkable letter because it was so fresh. The experience was so fresh, and she was a lot more personal in that letter than she had been in a lot of cases when she was giving more public testimony. That was amazing. And then there was also a master's thesis that a graduate student wrote on my mother. She interviewed her for tens of hours. It was 200 pages long, and 150 of those pages was dedicated to my mother's story. And that became a primary source material, as well as the video interview she gave for the USC Shoah Foundation, which is available on YouTube. And I provided that link to the organizers here. So those provided the richest details of my mother's youth, family, imprisonment, and survival. And then in addition to that, there was a book written by another survivor called The Judaria. And she lived in Rhodes at the time my mother lived in Rhodes, but she was a little bit younger. But it was another source material which gave me lots of background information on what daily life was like in Rhodes for the Jews at that time. So all of that, plus a lot more. Actually, my problem was sort of deciding what to rely on and what to leave out. That was an unusual problem, but maybe a happy problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a nice segue into, and I'll ask Naomi, go ahead and start if you'd like. If you can both talk a little bit about what surprised you the most then. I mean, you found this letter, it's in Italian, and you had it translated, and Naomi, you're talking about resources that, like everything has changed in 8 years. So what has surprised you the most about what you have come across?
Yeah, so, well, a lot surprised me because, I didn't have a lot of detail, especially on my father's side of the family, on the Hungarian side. So what I learned on that side was really surprising. So in my family, the little I knew about my Hungarian grandparents was that while they were Holocaust survivors, they hadn't been in the camps. That's what I was told. And what I learned in my research was that the part of Hungary that my grandparents were from was Transcarpathia, Subcarpathian Mountains, where essentially them and all the Jews in the area were deported off to Auschwitz. And that is what in fact ended up happening to a lot of my relatives, although not my grandparents. what I found in my research is that my grandfather had actually been in 3 different camps. Now, he wasn't in Auschwitz and he didn't have a number on his arm, but again, the family mythology was that Grandpa was never in a camp. He didn't have a number. So I was surprised when I learned that he was in Mauthausen, which is a very well-known camp, that he was indeed in a camp, and in fact in multiple camps. So that was surprising. The other big surprise that I got was, so a little more about my grandparents, about the story, was that my grandparents, after the war, they met in a displaced persons camp in Germany. That's where a lot of displaced persons camps were. And then they came to the US. Now, I didn't know that they had met in a DP camp until I did my research. But what I learned is that they had met there and they had married there. And that's where my aunt and my father were born. Now, I think back and I still can't believe that I made it, so many decades without knowing the answer to where was my father born. I knew he was born in Germany, but nobody had ever posed or answered the question, why, what was a Jew being born in Germany in 1949? What's the story behind that? But that was the story. They were born in a DP camp. And so those were 2 very big surprises that just, we never could have seen coming.
Yeah, of course, of course. Estelle, would you like to answer?
Yes, I would. Well, again, there were, and my mother spoke publicly. Of course, there were details that were pretty gruesome that she left out in my research. A lot of those sort of daily horrors were revealed freshly, which was hard to know my mother had gone through that. But another area in which mother didn't talk about very much, because it usually wasn't part of the larger presentation she was giving, was so as the Allies were advancing and Auschwitz was being either liquidated or everyone was being moved onto the death marches back to Russia, back to Germany. My mother was also moved, and I thought she had been on that march, but actually she was taken by train to a munitions factory inside Germany, and she spent several months there, again as a prisoner of the Germans, drilling holes in the machine gun, the thing that the bullets go through, in this little circular piece of metal every day for hours and hours. But they gave her a little bit better food, And then when she was liberated, finally, it wasn't like the next day she was free and everything was great, because Rhodes was no longer Italian and it now belonged to Greece. And so she really literally didn't have a home to go back to. And she and her sisters, and 2 sisters and a cousin, kind of basically moved from place to place throughout Europe for the next year before finally they got back to Italy. And then ultimately 2 of them came to the United States. So that journey was a whole other story, where they were moved from camp to camp to camp, and most of the camps were broken down and they had to literally fix them up so they could stay there. That was another ordeal she didn't really talk about.
Mm-hmm. That's the second time you've said there was something she didn't talk about, and there were some parts of her story that you didn't dive as deeply into. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about how the experience of researching your family history and learning more about your mother's experience has affected you emotionally?
Well, there are kind of 2 moments kind of strike me. And one is so I talked about the video that the testimony on YouTube, and it's really takes you into daily life in the camp. And so you really experience the degradation and the desperation and the hunger and the thirst and the fear and the death and all of that. And there's just a moment where in the video where she just talks about kind of the low point, kind of like how hungry and dirty and starved and thirsty, and their bodies were failing them, and just they were looking up to the sky and saying, why, God, why, and trying to live through that, just keeping the faith, just day after day, not knowing if you were going to live from moment to moment, literally. And there was just a point where I was playing this song that I listened to sometimes, and it was sad. And then I was listening to my mother, and then I just started crying and crying and crying. And that was really a moment. That was probably my lowest point. I was just sobbing. And then there was another point at which, after I had finished writing my presentation, which was originally about 15 pages, single spaced, I thought I had been saving it in Word all along, but it turned out there was a problem I didn't know about it. And then I lost the document. And after 3 or 4 months of having worked on it, I thought I could never go through that again. Fortunately, I was able to recover it about a half an hour later, but that was a terrible moment where I just thought, I cannot live through this again, this emotion to go start over.
Yeah, absolutely. Naomi, would you be willing to speak a little bit about how it's affected you emotionally as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's been, I'd say, pretty difficult, a lot of the time, so first of all, as I mentioned at the beginning, I didn't really start doing a lot of research until after my grandparents had already passed away. So there was this regret at the, missed opportunity. I mean, I was fortunately able to talk to a couple of our survivor relatives, but, considering I grew up with these people and spent a lot of time with them, it just seemed like, there's some regret on the wasted opportunity, that I never really got to hear from them personally, anything about this, or, hardly anything, aside from those tapes that one grandparent left. The other thing is that, my Polish grandparents were barely 18 years old in the fall of 1939 when they ran from Warsaw, where they were living, and and escaped ultimately to Russia through some very hairy circumstances. My Hungarian grandmother was not quite 18 when she arrived at the TP camp. So, the several years up until she was about 18 were spent, under very dire circumstances, including the Budapest ghetto. My children now are 15 and 17, and to just think about, the 3 of my grandparents were essentially the same age while they were going through this is just, really hard to fathom. And it just also makes me, think that because, I think my family is not unique. I think a lot of survivor families, some are like Estelle's, where there was a lot talked about, and a lot are like mine, where really nothing were talked about. And I just kind of left with this feeling that, I didn't really know them because, this part of them wasn't really shared. So that part, that part could be difficult. The other part that I think is difficult, for Holocaust, for people researching, their relatives in the Holocaust is, you spend a lot of time. My grandparents, especially my Hungarian ones, came from a town. They had a lot of siblings, and they had a lot of cousins and a lot of relatives. And the way a lot of Jewish families worked at the time is that a lot of the names are repeated over and over and over. And just looking at, deportation lists and, and victim testimonials about what happened to people who ultimately perished over and over, that has, my name, my sister's name, my mother's name. These aren't us, but, the names repeat in generations, and seeing that some of them, when they passed away, they were, babies, children, toddlers. It does wear on you after a while. Sometimes when you do this research, it's easy to go down these rabbit holes and to spend all day Sunday researching it. And then, at a certain point, you have to get up and walk away and go outside the house and, go on a walk in the field or something.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. It brings me to my next question. Estelle, if you'd like to answer this one first, actually, if you can talk a little bit about how what you learn as you're doing your family research over the course of the research and now has affected your sense of identity.
Oh, yes. That's a great question. Yes, I think it really has. So the thing that's going on with me currently, I think, is that in this particular time in our world, when we're so frayed in our American social and political order, I see these troubling themes and rhetorics in the discourse that echo the themes and the rhetoric from Nazi Germany. And that feels very personal to me, very personal. And I'm not suggesting we're going to have concentration camps and we're going to put people in them, but there is a lot of rhetoric and propaganda that echoes some of the things that were going on. You know, my mother lived way far away. She lived at the bottom of the Mediterranean, close to Turkey. And Hitler and his regime slowly worked their way down to as far as they could go. That was the last place. I know that hate and if partners really have long tentacles, and you think, well, I'm safe, right? I'm safe. Well, I don't know that anyone can say I'm safe.
I think similarly to Estelle. I mean, I think for me, doing this research has definitely, I guess, shifted my identity a little bit, a little more towards, I guess, identifying as Jewish. I mean, I've always thought of myself as Jewish, but I was raised actually in a highly secular family. All of my grandparents, I think, were religious back when they were growing up in Europe, but one set, they basically stopped being religious altogether. The other side was Orthodox, but my family growing up, my family of origin, was essentially secular. But learning about all this just kind of made me more interested, because I know that they were all religious. They were all raised in a religious way of just, well, they were religious, and then this happened to them. One side abandoned it, one side clung deeper. What is this really all about? So I joined a synagogue and I participated in it. So I'd say that, there was that part, but then more to what Estelle was talking about, it also made me realize that, it's my personal responsibility to speak up about injustice, that I have, that never again is my personal responsibility to contribute to that. And so, I used to, I guess, be more of like a silent supporter of a lot of things, and doing this, and especially with the way the climate has kind of changed, the political climate has changed. I'd say the last few years have definitely led me to identify as someone who needs to speak up about injustice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Going back just a little bit, you were mentioning Naomi, all the different family members, there's this side and that side, some secular, some not. Can you talk a little bit about what it's been like to discover new family members, if you have discovered new family members?
Yeah, so first of all, in terms of family, I mean, one thing I just want to mention about family when you do this is that I think Estelle and I have talked about in the past is, when I was discovering all this stuff, I was really excited to tell people. And I was kind of surprised to find out that less people in my family really shared my interest or excitement at learning about this. But it was able to, first of all, reconnect or connect me with family members that I didn't know I had, just kind of through the family gossip chain of, Naomi's been doing family research. I found out that my cousin Leah in Boston, I have a cousin Leah in Boston who's a third cousin or once removed, but she does research too. And so, through social media, I was introduced to her, and now we correspond and share information. And that's actually been very helpful. And then there was another cousin, actually, I was introduced to the same way, cousin of mine named Brian in Philadelphia, just through kind of the family gossip chain. And when I reconnected with him, he was like me. He didn't really know much about our background. So we were able to figure out specifically how we were related. But then what was exciting, one thing that was exciting about meeting Brian was that he said, I was going through my grandmother's closet the other day, and I found a box of photos, and there are these photos in here that are unidentified. And he pulls up a photo, and on the back is written my aunt's name, and it's a picture of a baby. And it was my aunt who was born in the DP camp. And it's the only known photo of her. My aunt had never seen it before. I just said, well, that's my aunt's name, and that's the year she was born. And we were able to send it to my aunt. She's in her 70s, and it was the first time she ever saw a baby picture of herself, because they came to the US when she was about 3. So that was exciting. And another way I met family members, which I think a lot of people who do this type of research do this sort of thing, is I had a DNA test through one of the commercial services, 23andMe. Now, if you're like me and you're either, 100% Ashkenazi Jewish or 50%, which a lot of people who are descended from Holocaust survivors are, 23andMe is going to tell you that you have thousands and thousands of cousins. And that tends to not be very helpful. But that combined with my genealogical research did lead me to a cousin who was kind of, who was basically like a second cousin once removed. We met on 23andMe, and then we were able to figure out through our, through my research how we were connected. And that's when he discovered that his neighbors who he grew up with were actually his cousins. Talk about family secrets. that they were cousins, and that's what my family research helped to expose. So, I think that when people are doing research, even if your family, my family is very small. We didn't have a whole lot of survivors after the war, so we don't have a ton of people. People didn't write down a lot, but I'd say asking through the family still produced little bits of information that really helped me connect things together. So even though you think, well, that distant cousin and over in Miami probably doesn't know anything, it might be worth an email, because I had little bits of information that really helped me connect some dots.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Estelle, did you have an experience?
Can you ask that question again?
Yeah, I was curious if through your research, if in any form, whether it was doing a DNA test or using ancestry.com, if you discovered new family members, and if so, what that was like for you.
Okay, no, I didn't do either one of those things.
Yeah, fabulous. I will direct my next question again. I'm going to go to Estelle. So I'm wondering if there's anything you wish you had known when you first started investigating, and what you might recommend to others as they begin the process of performing some family research.
Right. It's interesting when you are doing research. Well, let me just say this. When the subject are your parents, for example, or people that you're super close to, you have your primary relationship with them. So it's like father, son, mother, daughter, or whatever, right? And so you relate to those people in that way. And sometimes it's okay when people say, I didn't know much about my parents' history, or I didn't ask questions or enough questions or any questions or whatever. It's okay, because really those relationships, that you have with people close to you, the primariness of the relationship is the most important thing. And the research is kind of secondary, the questions. And so it's like, yes, she's my mother, but she's also my subject of my research, right? Or asking her questions. She doesn't want to burden me. Like, that's why she didn't give me a lot of details. I mostly got the information through her presentations that I attended when she was still doing them, and also the recordings. But she didn't want to talk about it like at the dinner table. And I didn't really want to ask, because she's my mom, and that's the kind of relationship we had, and that's fine. And it's also, my advice also at the same time is to don't wait to do it. If you have really living relatives, talk with them, interview them, and learn their histories. It is true that you can expect that people will be reluctant to talk. And they may refuse to talk, and that's their right. Not wanting to relive trauma isn't really specific to the Holocaust, it's just specific to human beings. But if you go and research and you have questions and your subject is still alive, go back and talk to them. So don't just take one bite of the apple. Sometimes when you have stuff, information gets started and you say, this is what I've learned, can you help me? They're more willing to do that. I will say that even though I had an abundance of information of my source material on my mother, when I actually did write out the presentation, I had so many questions that I wish I had asked. Even though I had this much information, I wanted this much information, more. And I waited too long for that. If I had started my research and my writing prior to her having passed away, that would have been a good thing. I could have gotten the answer to some of the questions I still don't have. So don't wait. That's my That's my advice.
Naomi, do you, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that. I mean, obviously I waited, I did this, I didn't start my research till all my grandparents had passed away. And so I missed out on some information there. I was able to interview my grandmother's cousin, who was also an Auschwitz survivor, before she passed away. And so that was, I was glad I had that opportunity. So I would also agree, don't wait. Ask people to look in their basements and in their closets for that box in the back. I mean, my father swore up and down he had nothing, and then he found this little plastic box that had a few documents. It only shed a little bit of light, but it was still just interesting. It had some interesting documents in it that helped a little bit and just kind of pointed me in the right direction. So I'd say, that's another thing. And finally, I'd say, don't be surprised to find that what you were told is not true. Kind of like my story about how, my grandfather wasn't in the camp supposedly, and then I find out he's in 3 camps. That's a really common fact pattern of, grandma said this, grandpa said this, and then you do research and found out that, that was a historical impossibility, or you find out, evidence that just completely contradicts it. And some of those things are very minor, and some of those things are really major. And sometimes it's a little bit baffling to figure out, why they would not tell the truth about this, but, they just do. And so, so don't be surprised to uncover that. And then, finally, when, family members aren't always willing to accept that the stories they were told aren't true, and that wasn't really true in my family, but I hear that in other people's families, in the kind of, in these research forums that sometimes I'm in, people complain about that, they're just not believed, or that people get upset that you would tarnish grandma's memory in such a way by implying she didn't tell the truth. So that's just, some things to be on the lookout. Those are really normal things we encounter a lot.
Mm-hmm. Did either of you encounter specific resistance from your family members, or from places where you were seeking resources? Was that an issue that either of you encountered?
Well, no, I mean, my family members weren't resistant. They just weren't, some of them, there were a couple that were pretty interested. Most people just, they were, it wasn't a big interest. I mean, genealogy is a time consuming hobby. It requires, it's time consuming, and it can be intense. And so there just wasn't a lot of interest. As far as other, outside the family, there's a lot more resources online. I think we're going to talk about that soon. But if, there's some things that are just hard to access. There's like my Polish grandfather supposedly served in the military somewhere in Poland. I can't find any evidence of this online, but I've also been told that some of the archives I need are only in Poland. So, so you might run into walls, and then there's other records that just were burned and didn't exist, and so it's like, there's just no information. Another area that some people will come up against, which I definitely did, but others don't, was, so my family on all sides, I come from a long line, I guess, of poor people, non-property owners, people didn't have a lot of wealth or education. And so those people don't leave as much of a footprint a lot of times. So, if your family's from the city, my family, a lot of them were from outside the city in rural areas. They weren't, they didn't have statusy type jobs. And so if your family was more prominent, you may have a lot more luck with the research. If your family's like mine, there just might not be any records.
Mm-hmm. Estelle, do you have something similar?
Well, nobody was resistant, because most of the material I used was already in existence. I didn't have to, there weren't any relatives to interview, but I did try to get some photographs of my mother's sisters from my cousins, and they didn't seem to have any, which is understandable. I mean, any ones of their parents as children, my aunt and uncle, my aunts and stuff as children. But let's see, there was 2 parts to that, and I forgot the second part.
Just if you had encountered any resistance from family members, or from institutions or organizations that you were seeking resources from.
Oh, no, not at all. But to Naomi's point of kind of stories or facts that don't turn out to be facts, or when I interrogated all the materials on my mother of stories that she, her narrative and all that, I did find discrepancies over time between one narrative and another, like when in time something happened. That's kind of normal because our memories are kind of malleable. And I don't dispute the actual facts, of her ordeal. But I mean, it's true that you may not remember the precise order in which something happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I also remember a conversation I had with my mother. There was a story about her cousin in Los Angeles when the in one of the Jewish newspapers in Los Angeles about her cousin Maru. And I read the story, and they actually were together in the camps, and they were together after liberation. They kind of made that journey back to their freedom together. And when I read the story about Maru and specifically what happened after liberation, I said, I didn't know Maru did that. I didn't know Maru did that, this, and then the other thing. And she goes, oh, she didn't, her memory is not very good. That didn't happen. She maybe Maru kind of folded in stories from other people or who knows what. But I mean, but her basic story is true, but there were some little things that she took credit for that maybe weren't quite accurate. And that's just human memory and how we experience things. That I don't be too critical about that, I would say. Just try to reconcile it to the best of your ability, because you're telling a story and it has to be based on truth, but each fact of the story may have some variance to it, and that's normal when you're doing personal histories.
Very interesting. Okay. Estelle, since you did mention it, excuse me, Naomi, you mentioned it. If we, I will ask if you could talk a little bit about the institutions, organizations, archives who have been particularly helpful for both of you in your research.
Yeah, sure. So probably, so in the chat, there were some resources that were put in there, and I'd say that these are really kind of some of the starting places. I'd say, the Yad Vashem and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum websites just have an incredible amount of information from lots of different databases. You can search by names. Those are kind of the first places that you want to start, or those two places, and also the Errolson Archives. That used to be International Tracing Service. That's where there's just so many primary source documents. I think it's Yad Vashem where there's a lot of the testimonials. So, where I was able to find, for example, it turns out that in the 1970s, there was some solicitation for people to write testimonials about their, about the relatives of theirs who had perished in the Holocaust. And my grandparents had written, several of them, about their family members, about their sisters and brothers and nieces and nephews and parents that nobody in my family knew about, but I found them online. And that was actually the key way I started my family tree on Ancestry.com, was through those records, through the testimonials. So those are great. Jewish Gen is a great website. It also is a website that has a lot of different resources coming in from different places. And what makes that one good is that one thing that you're going to notice if you're doing research on Holocaust survivors and victims is that your family's experience is going to vary a lot depending on where in Europe they were at the time. So like one set of my grandparents were in Warsaw, Poland at the beginning of the war in 1939. The others were in Subcarpathian Hungary, which was, not untouched, but was relatively left alone until, almost 1944. Their entire experiences were completely different. The records available for it is completely different for rural Jews, for rural people versus city people, and from people who are in, there's plenty of other countries obviously that were touched by the Holocaust. So if your family research is really going to be specific to that, and Jewish Gen I think does a good job of linking you to resources that even help you get down to what the ancestral town is. In my family's case, it's the Polish side is easier. On the Hungarian side, it was hard. My grandparents are from a region that, when my grandfather was born in 1910, was called Hungary. When my grandmother was born in 1928, was called Czechoslovakia. Then in 1939 became Hungary again, and now is part of Ukraine. So, when you do research, am I looking for Hungarian research, Czech research, or Ukraine? And it kind of depends on what resources you need. Mostly my grandparents are considered Hungarian Jews for the purposes of research, but other countries had other experiences. They were shifting borders. Another resource I want to point out is the USC Stoa Foundation's Visual History Archives. That's the archive that basically Steven Spielberg went and interviewed thousands of survivors. Now, they've put some of them online, but not all of them. Some of them are only accessible in person at a specific, mostly at universities. And so, I know they're putting more and more online. And if you're a descendant of somebody who has an interview there, you can actually request a copy. You're able to search through. So that's one place to look and see if anybody you're related to left an interview. And then finally, the last thing I want to highlight, which was more helpful to me than I ever could have imagined, was Facebook. The main Facebook, there's a Facebook group called Jewish Genealogy Portal that is an absolute must for anybody who's doing genealogy research, Holocaust related or not, even if you're not Holocaust related, but certainly Holocaust related. You definitely want to go to Jewish Genealogy Portal. It's a gigantic group filled with everybody from the first-time complete amateur researcher to people who've been doing this for decades, know multiple languages, and can really just tell you a lot of specialized knowledge, point you in the right direction. I'm just going to tell I have time for a couple quick anecdotes about what I found for that group. So when I found in my father's basement some documents, I wasn't sure what they were, but they were written in Hebrew and Yiddish and Hungarian and Russian. And so I went to Jewish Genealogy Group and I scanned in the documents and uploaded it and said, I don't even know what languages these are in. Can anybody point me to a translator? I was going to look for a translator to translate these documents. And I don't think 30 minutes went by before several people had responded with the translations of the documents to me. So there are people they just can't wait. Another great thing that happened was somebody posted on that same group saying, I'm going to be in Ukraine, doing research at the county seats. Is it anybody's relative at this particular county? And that's the county my grandmother's from. They're not called counties, bless. Anyway, he took a picture of a microfilm. He printed out the microfilm picture of my grandmother's birth record, which it was the only evidence I have of my grandmother's actual date of birth. She's fudged it so many times on so many different documents. And finally, the last, I've got a lot of great information off of, that group and other Facebook groups, but the last thing I want to talk about that I found on Facebook was, so I discovered, as I said, through other research that my grandfather, what camps my grandfather was liberated from. And I was able to find I came across the Facebook group of the US infantry troop that had liberated his camp. And so I went on there and just posted one Veterans Day. I said, happy Veterans Day to the veteran, to the 71st. Thank you for your service. My grandfather, you liberated my grandfather from Gunskirchen. And one of the liberators, who was 90 something years old, responded, and we became friends. Me and Frank became friends. And last year when I was in California, I actually visited him, and I got to hear his stories about Liberation Day when he liberated my grandfather in 1945. So, those are the type of things that only happen nowadays because of social media, but don't count it out. There's a lot of researchers on social media who are doing a lot of great research who can really save you time and point you in the right direction.
Wow. Wow. Estelle, are there other resources that you're familiar with that haven't been mentioned that you'd like to mention?
No, Naomi, that was incredible. I wasn't, because I had so much information, I didn't have to go to a lot of those sources, although I did go to Yad Vashem and the Holocaust Museum websites. But I did some research for a friend who's working on her mother's story, her parents' story. And I've been to a lot of the places that she mentioned, and somebody asked the question in the chat, like, what happens if you don't have, I think, the name change or the spelling changes. And the great thing about the archives, especially Yad Vashem, is that it's searchable in a number of ways. So maybe you only have a couple letters in the name, maybe only the first name, maybe you have the year they were born, or if you know the town they lived in, you can search by town, or that way. So there's so many. It's a very flexible search, and in the Jewish genealogy pages, there are tons and tons of links to other archives, and those archives have infinite ways to search too. So you don't have to have every bit of information to get to the source material you're looking for.
Yeah, I would agree with that, you know, the spelling thing is difficult. You know, even, I mean, I didn't know any of my grandparents' town names, but the interesting thing about my Hungarian grandparents is that the town names not just changed spelling, but changed complete names when different countries took over. So it's a name that has no letters in common today, the town name, as it did back then. So it makes the research hard. So that's just something, that's when you have to become really more, you really have to start sharing resources with other researchers for your region, so that way we can wade through those language issues and figure out that, you know, the town name you thought you knew the name of is spelled much differently than you ever thought. But I mean, you know, the problem I came across in that was that both of my grandmothers have you know, on one side of my family, the name is Klein, which is basically the same name as Smith. You know, in the US, it's the equivalence. You know, if your family's name is Klein, I mean, it's just almost impossible to find records, you know. So it's difficult. You know, you run into, it can be painstaking work, and you end up running into dead ends or into open-ended bits of information where you're not sure what you're seeing. It's the problem.
You can also, there's websites where you can search ship manifests if you know approximately when somebody entered the United States. And from where you can often find them in a ship's manifest.
Yeah, and those, I actually found my, the information on how my family members came over here. One of them was on a ship and one was an airplane, but I found that in Errolson. That's where I found some of that.
There's a question in the Q&A. Someone's asking, she's mentioned that her grandparents are going to be visiting, and she's just beginning her journey into this research. And she's wondering if there are, if what you recommend asking to begin, like what are some essential questions you would recommend somebody start with?
I think that, you know, I mean, I guess it kind of depends what you know about the person's background. You know, if we're just talking about, you know, what their experience was, like, are we talking, you know, is your grandparent a survivor, or you're just trying to get their history? I mean, I'm in favor of, you know, more open-ended, you know, grandma, tell me about your life, you know, and see what they tell you and where it goes, and try to write, you know, see if they will allow you to record it. That's the tapes I have. My grandmother's tapes that my cousin recorded, is she just put it, literally, it was the 80s. So she put a tape recorder in front of her, and just, my grandmother just started talking, and you can hear from the tapes that, like, she did it over probably 3 days, because I could hear her start and stop. And so I'm, you know, a fan of that, but I, you know, want to warn people, if your family member is a survivor, or, you know, of the Holocaust or a different traumatic event, I'd use caution about, you know, about jumping in with asking too many details about, you know, the traumatic experiences. I think that that's, you know, some people have bad reactions to that, don't necessarily want to talk about it. I think it's something that, when I was interviewing, for example, my cousin, who I knew was in Auschwitz, you know, I talked to her for a long time, and then ultimately decided not to directly ask her about that experience. You know, I asked her about our family, you know, what the family was like before the war. I asked her about what she was doing, you know, all that. And then I asked her about her experiences after, but she never volunteered to me that, you know, what specific, you know, any details really about Auschwitz, except that she was there. And so it just felt, I kind of read the room, and it just felt like she didn't want to talk about it. And I think if you're feeling that, then I think it's important to respect that.
Another question in the chat is, if doing your family research has led you to travel to any of the places in Europe that you have discovered that you have family members from, or that you knew your parents or your grandparents lived, if that happened for either of you.
Yes, that happened for me. I was in Rhodes in 2009. Just for really 24 hours. But I'm going back again for 3 days in May. And this time I'm going to engage a guide who can give us more background on Rhodes and the Jewish community at that time. So I visited the last remaining synagogue. That's more of a museum in 2009, but I want to stay longer and do more things. And then I was supposed to, I had signed up for a tour of Jewish sites in Germany and Poland that ended up going, was supposed to go to Auschwitz, and he was supposed to do 3 or 4 days of service work, stay there and do 3 or 4 days of service work at the memorial there. But that got canceled because of COVID, and now it's completely off their tour roster. So hopefully if they reschedule that, I'll go back and do that. But to me, that would be, to me, that's very important to do that. And it's a way to honor my mother and all the survivors and those who didn't survive.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Naomi, did you want to answer as well?
Yeah, so I haven't traveled back yet. I actually was hoping to go to Poland this summer. That's kind of what I'm planning to do still, I think, was to go to Poland and, visit Warsaw and then also visit some of the camps. As my other grandparents who are from Hungary, I mean, that's in Ukraine now, so that's kind of off for a while. But I do hope one day to visit there. I know some of my cousins visited in like the 90s or early 2000s and went back. It could be difficult though. It's like I definitely want to go to Warsaw and to Poland and tour the camps. To go to Subcarpathia though, that part of Hungary. I mean, the truth is that there's no Jews living there. There haven't been since World War II. They did actually eradicate all the Jews in the region. So I was kind of warned by my cousins that they went back and there's not really remnants to go look at. So they kind of were trying, I think, to discourage me. So I still have to. Obviously I have time on that trip before I can plan that trip anyway. But yeah, I think it did spark my interest a lot in going and visiting.
I'm mindful of the time. I know that we need to wrap up. I want to say thank you so much to both of you. I think Gail is probably going to jump back on and go ahead and wrap up for us. But if there's anything else that I wonder if it's okay for the two of you, if folks still have some questions, if they might be able to email us and we can direct them to you for I think there might be a couple others in the chat, and I just want to make sure that folks can get their questions answered. So I just want to say thank you again to you both for being here and for your time and for sharing your stories.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes,
Okay. And I'll add my thanks. Thank you, Estelle. Thank you, Naomi, for sharing your experiences with us today about researching your family's history and how doing this work impacted you both personally and emotionally. And I learned so much. I know I feel inspired to try to dig into my family's history, and I hope that others who logged on today to join us will feel the same. And a big thank you to my colleague, Alicia Babstein, OJMCHE'S Archivist, for moderating such a meaningful conversation. I do want to just let you all know that there will be a follow-up email that you'll receive probably in about 2 days, which will include all the resources that we had put into the chat, as well as a link to the recording if you wish to watch that. And there'll probably be the link to Estelle's mother's testimony. So anything that you feel like you might have missed in the chat, have no fear. It will be coming to your inbox in about a day or two. And thank you again for joining us. And I wish everyone a good afternoon.
Okay, thanks.
Take care all.
Thank you.